let's say we want to utilize this provided store not in the app component, but in the counter component which I rendered there. That's this counter component in the components folder. We got more components there, we'll use them later. For the moment, it's the counter component that matters to us. Now that's the component you're seeing on the screen here when you're running your dev server. It shows us basically a container where we want to output the counter value. We got a toggle counter button for hiding or showing the counter. Now here I want to start by outputting the current counter. And for this, we need to get access to our Redux store and to the data in there. And we again do that with help of the React Redux library. So from React Redux, we again want to import something. And the something which we are importing is a React hook, a custom hook made by the React Redux team. The use selector hook. There also is a use store hook, which we could use as well, which gives us direct access to the store. But use selector is a bit more convenient to use because that allows us to then automatically select a part of our state managed by the store. So I will use selector here. Now, if we would be using a class-based component and not a functional component as we are here, and as we are in the majority of the course, then there also is a connect function, which we could use instead. This function can be used as a wrapper around our class component to connect that class component to the store. I'll come back to that later. For the moment, we'll focus on use selector. So here in this functional component, we can now get access to the data managed in our store by using use selector. We call this, and now we need to pass a function to use selector. A function which will be executed by React Redux, a function which then basically determines which piece of data we want to extract from our store. Of course, at the moment, we have a very simple state, just an object with a counter property. But in bigger applications, you will have more complex states with tons of different properties, maybe nested objects and arrays, and therefore being able to just get a slice, just a tiny part of that overall state object in an easy way is worth a lot. And that's what useSelector allows us to do. For this, we should pass a function to it, a function which will receive the state managed by Redux, and then we return the part of the state which we want to extract. So here, for example, state.counter. Again, this function will be executed for us by React Redux. It will then pass the Redux state, so the managed data, into this function when it executes it, and then basically executes this code to retrieve the part of the state which you need in this component. And then use selector, therefore overall, gives us that returned value. So we get a counter constant, which is the counter managed by Redux. Now the great thing is that when you use selector, React Redux will automatically set up a subscription to the Redux store for this component. So your component will be updated and will receive the latest counter automatically whenever that data changes in the Redux store. So it's then automatically reactive, and changes to the Redux store will cause this component function to be re-executed. So you always have the latest counter. That's why useSelector is a very useful hook and why it is the hook we use for getting data out of the store. If you ever would unmount this component, if it would be removed from the DOM for whatever reason, React Redux would also automatically clear the subscription for you. So it manages that subscription for you behind the scenes. Now that we got this counter, we can use it down there to output the counter value like this. And if we now save this, we therefore now see 0 here. And that's how we can get access to data managed by Redux. Of course, the question now is how we can change that data. How can we dispatch actions? Now for dispatching actions, I first of all want to have two new buttons here which allow me to dispatch actions for incrementing and decrementing. So here I'll add a new div, and in that div I'll just add two buttons. The first one says increment, the second one says decrement, so that we have these buttons. And now to add some spacing, I'll quickly dive into counter module CSS and add this selector .counter button, which selects these buttons here. And I'll just give them a margin of 1 rem in all directions, just so that we have some spacing. Now, with that added, with that set up, now we want to wire up those two buttons, increment and decrement, so that they do increase or decrease the counter by 1. Now we know that we need to dispatch an action for that, but how does that work from inside a React component? Well, there is another hook which we can use, the use dispatch hook. When we call use dispatch here, we don't pass any argument to it, but instead this gives us back a dispatch function which we can execute. So dispatch here is a function which we can call, which will dispatch an action against our Redux store. So therefore now I'll add two new functions here in this counter component, the increment handler and the decrement handler. So two new functions which will wire up to the buttons. And in the increment handler, we want to use this dispatch function and execute it to dispatch a new action, and then do what we learned. An action is an object with a type property. So let's add such an object here as an argument to the dispatch function call, so that we dispatch this specific object. And then the value for type should be one of the identifiers we use in our Redux store reducer. So here in the reducer function, we handle the action type increment and the action type decrement. So we should dispatch one of these two identifiers. Of course, exactly these identifiers without any typos or changes. So back in counter, here I'll dispatch increment. And then here in the decrement handler, I'll dispatch an object with a type property with a value of decrement. Now we need to wire up those two functions to the buttons. So on this first button, we add a on click prop and point at the increment handler. And on the second button, we do the same for the decrement handler. And if we do that and save this, if we now click increment, you see the counter increases. And if we click decrement, it decreases. So now we're able to use what we learned about Redux in this React demo, in this React component here. Now, even though it's not the focus of this course, because it's not the common way of writing components, I wanna briefly talk about class-based components instead of functional components. Because whilst nowadays we typically do use functional components only, there still are a lot of projects out there that do use class-based components instead. And there, of course, also are simply people who prefer that, and there's nothing wrong with class-based components. Therefore, I also want to show you how this counter component would look like if we would build it as a class-based component. For this, I'll add a class named counter here, and that class needs to extend the React component object, the React component class. So I'll import from React, I will import component like this. And with that imported here, we extend component. Now that's what you learned in a separate module about class-based components. That's how they work. Now in here, we then can add a constructor to initialize our state, but here we don't have any state. Instead here, we then add the render method, which should of course return this JSX code. So I'll copy that and return this JSX code here. But now we need to add increment and decrement handler methods, a toggle counter handler method, even though we're not doing anything with that yet. And we then need to make sure that we get access to our counter. So let's add a couple of methods here. Let's start with the increment handler method, then the decrement handler method, and also the toggle counter handler method. And this is how we can add methods in JavaScript classes. Now down here, we now want to hook this up correctly by using this increment handler and this decrement handler and this toggle counter handler, referring to these methods which are part of this class. And then the question now is, how do we get access to Redux here? In the functional component, we used hooks, use dispatch and use selector. But hooks are not usable in class-based components. Now, I briefly did mention it before. React Redux also exports a connect function, which is a function that helps you connect class-based components to Redux. Actually, you could also use it on functional components, but for functional components, using these hooks is simply more convenient. But no matter if it's a functional or class-based component, you can use connect, and therefore we will use connect here on this class-based component. How do we use it? When we export our counter, we don't export the counter component like this. Instead, we call connect, and now connect, when executed, will actually return a new function as a value, which we then execute again. And then we pass our component to that returned function as an argument. So this can look strange, but connect is a so-called higher order component. We execute the connect function, it then returns a new function, and we execute this new function as well. And to this returned function, we pass counter. Now, why do we do it like this? Because to connect, when we execute this, we also pass something. Connect also wants some arguments. Connect also wants some arguments. It wants 2 arguments to be precise, and both arguments are functions. I'll write them separately here. The first function is a function that maps Redux state to props, which will be received in this component then. Hence, we call this function map state to props. That's not a name you must use, but a convention which you will see in a lot of projects. Now, this is a function which receives the Redux state, and then this returns an object where the keys will be available as props in the receiving component, so in the counter component, and the values of those keys, that is then the logic for drilling into that Redux state. So here we could expose a counter prop by using counter as a key here. This key name therefore is up to you. And the value is state.counter. So we then pick the counter value from the Redux state and bind that value to the counter prop. That's what we do here in the end. And that's of course similar to what we do with use selector. Here we also get the state and drill into the state to get the counter and then store that in a counter const. That's basically the equivalent when not doing it with hooks, but with the connect function. Because now map state to props is the first argument we pass to connect. The second argument is another function, which is typically called map dispatch to props. It's the equivalent to use dispatch. Now the idea is to store dispatch functions in props, so that in the counter component, we have certain props which we can execute as a function, which will then, when executed, dispatch an action to the Redux store. For this, map dispatch to props receives the dispatch function as an argument automatically, just like map state to props, the map dispatch to props function will be executed for you by Redux. And then in here, we also return an object where the keys are prop names, which we can then use in the component. So for example, increment as a name. And the value is then another function in which we call dispatch and then set up our action. For example, here, an action where the type is increment. This might look strange, but in the end, this ensures that in the counter component, we'll have an increment prop, which we can use. This prop holds this function, so we can execute this function from inside the component thereafter. And when we do so, we will call dispatch and dispatch this action. And we can therefore also do this for decrement and dispatch the action with a type of decrement. And now that's the second argument we pass to connect, a pointer at this map dispatch to props function. These are just pointers. We don't execute map state to props or map dispatch to props here. We just point at them. They will be executed for us by React Redux. And when using connect, React Redux will still set up a subscription and manage a subscription for you. It will do all of that. It's just an alternative to using the use dispatch and use selector hooks. And obviously that's a bit shorter and easier, I would say. But if you're working with class-based components, you can't use hooks, and then this is your equivalent. So therefore now, to take advantage of these props which we map into our component, in the counter component, in increment handler, we can now execute this .props increment, because on our props in this component, we'll have a prop named increment because of our mapping here. And in the decrement handler, we therefore can execute this props decrement. And here in our JSX code, where we want to output the counter, we would use this props counter because we received a counter through props because of us mapping this counter state to the counter prop here. Now, to make sure that everything works, because JavaScript works the way it does, we need to call bind here on the increment and decrement handler bindings in JSX and bind this to make sure that the this keyword inside of these methods refers to the class. So that's something we need to add here. And then we can comment out this functional counter component so that we don't have the same name being used twice in this file. And if we now save this, it's reloaded and we can still use it as before. It works as before, but now with a class-based component. Again, class-based components are not the focus of this course, but they do exist, they are valid, they are still getting used in a lot of projects, and therefore you should know how to connect those to Redux as well. Nonetheless, I will now again comment out all that code here essentially, and comment the functional counter component back in, and then export this functional counter component again, and get rid of all the imports which we don't need anymore. But I'll keep the commented code down there so that we have it for reference. And now you learned about both. Now we will stick to functional components, but it is worth knowing about class-based components and the connect function as well.